Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, there is a silence so absolute it stings the ears. A wind so fine it carries salt instead of sand. A place so dry the dead remain with their eyelashes intact. This is the Tarim Basin, where the kingdom of Lulan once stood, a land where girl buried over 3,800 years ago still watches the desert sky. She was found in 1980 near the edge of Lop Nur in what is now western China. Her skin was tanned but unbroken. Her long, reddish hair still wove across her brow in gentle strands. Her eyelashes, long and curled, were almost defiant in their survival, and her body lay wrapped in woolen cloth, stitched with simple, careful seams. No one knows her name, but she is called the Lulan Beauty. She is the first face of a kingdom that would not be remembered in chronicles, but in salt, wind, and silence. A kingdom that once sat at the crossroads of empires and then vanished entirely. Asterisk. To understand Lulan, must first understand the geography of being forgotten. The Tarim Basin is a massive elliptical depression surrounded on all sides by mountains that trap the desert like a bowl. The Taklamakan Desert, at its center, is one of the world's most deadly. Its name, loosely translated, means go in and you won't come out. But thousands of years ago, the basin was different. Around 2000 BCE, the Lop Nur region, now a salt flat of shimmering white, was once a large lake. The Tarim River fed it with meltwater from the surrounding mountains, and along its shores, communities began to emerge. One of them was Loulan. By the 2nd century BCE, Lulan had become a strategic outpost on the Silk Road. It was not a kingdom of marble palaces or legendary warriors. It was a kingdom of timing, trade, and thirst. Camels needed water, caravans needed shelter, and Lulan offered both. It stood near the banks of Lop Nur, at a curve in the river where the water lingered. Wells were dug, houses were built, and travelers from Persia, India, China, and the Greco-Bactrian borderlands passed through and paid tribute. For a time, the kingdom flourished by doing very little. It didn't invade, it didn't resist, simply existed and taxed everyone who walked across its path. A border kingdom of barter, wool, and bowls of dried apricots. But when you sit at the edge of many empires, you rarely remain unclaimed. For long, the Han dynasty noticed Lulan in the 2nd century BCE. The Emperor Wu of Han, obsessed with extending Chinese influence westward, sent his famous envoy, Zhang Qian, into Central Asia. Zhang Qian reported not only on the customs and crops of distant lands, but on the usefulness of Lulan as a strategic waypoint. Its location made it a natural gatekeeper. Control Lulan, and you control the Silk Road's edge. Soon, Lulan found itself pulled into the orbit of Chinese power, but it also maintained relationships with the Jiangnu, with the nomadic confederation that harassed the Han from the north. Lulan's kings attempted a balancing act, paid tribute to the Han, maintained friendship with the Jiangnu, survived in the middle. But the Han court didn't appreciate ambiguity in 77 BCE. After years of suspicion, Kuei launched a quiet act of geopolitical theater. Envoy Fu Jizi arrived in Lulan, bearing gifts and wine. He invited the king to a banquet, and there, according to Chinese records, he strangled the king with a silk cord. A new king, more compliant, was installed, and Lulan was renamed. The Chinese called it Shanshan, a bland, bureaucratic name, the kind history loses easily. And from this moment, the kingdom's memory begins to blur. Asterisk, asterisk. The kingdom, once known as Lulan, faded slowly. Not with fire or conquest, but with changes in water and wind. By the 4th century CE, the Tarim River had shifted its course. The lake began to dry without water. Lulan's wells turned sour. The wood cracked in its buildings. The sand crept in and stayed. People left. Trade dwindled. And by the 6th century, the city was gone. When explorers rediscovered Lulan in the early 20th century, led by the Swedish archaeologist Sven Hedin, they found only ruins, timbers poking through salt-crusted soil, writings in multiple scripts, Chinese, Kharosthi, Sanskrit, fragments of a multilingual, multicultural hub that had vanished completely from maps. No medieval chroniclers wrote of Lulan. No Western texts remembered it. Even Chinese historical memory kept it brief. A footnote in imperial records. It had been renamed, restructured, and then erased by geography itself. And so the girl in the desert, the Lulan beauty, lay undisturbed for millennia. Her face preserved not by monument, but by dryness. Her story buried not by violence, but by time. Asterisk, asterisk, what else lay beneath the sands? Chinese expeditions in the 1990s unearthed dozens more mummies, not just Chinese or Central Asian in appearance, but with features resembling Indo-Europeans. DNA analysis confirmed it. The early settlers of the Tarim Basin were genetically diverse. Lulan, it seemed, had been a crossroads even before it was a kingdom. Its people traded wool, metal, silk, and stories. But no one kept their chronicles. No scribes recorded their myths. No temples etched their gods in stone. What remained were burial grounds, some wrapped in reeds, others in felt, all astonishingly intact. One grave held a man with a leather cap and boots stitched in a diagonal pattern. Another contained a child, no more than 2, buried with a toy carved from antler. They were not kings or warriors, just people, traders, herdsmen, mothers, infants, all buried in silence, all vanished from the maps. Asterisk, asterisk. So, we ask, how does a place disappear so thoroughly? How does a kingdom that once taxed the Silk Road become a footnote? Perhaps the answer lies not in its ruins, but in its ordinariness. Lulan was not the seat of emperors, was not the site of a great battle. It was a logistical hub, boring, dusty, essential. And so, when it was gone, the world found new routes. The silk found new paths. And history forgot, or perhaps it didn't forget. It simply moved on, leaving behind a desert full of faces no one remembered, and a silence so complete it preserved even the eyelashes of the dead. What happens to a city when its river dies? Not in a flood, not with a war, but when the river simply wanders away, quietly, dispassionately, as if it has grown bored of its own course. This was Lulan's fate. You may recall from section 1 that Lulan, or Shanshan, as it was renamed, was once a shimmering dot of life on the edge of China's reach. Perched like a sentry near the ever-changing banks of the Lap Nor, its entire existence depended on the Tarim River, which flowed unpredictably through the desert, nourishing an otherwise dead world. And so, when that river changed its course in the 4th century CE, not because of politics or climate, but perhaps just by the random push of silt in time, Lulan was left behind. But before that silence fell, Lulan was not forgotten. In fact, for centuries, it was constantly remembered in the ledgers of tax officials, the dusty travelogues of Han envoys, the fragile pages of Buddhist monks seeking the West to trace the middle life of Lulan between its quiet birth and its salt-preserved death. We must follow these faint trails, and so We begin with the one resource that seems to survive every vanished kingdom: paperwork. Asterisk, asterisk. Some of the most haunting relics from Lulan's peak are not gold or sculpture, but wooden slips. These thin, palm-sized strips, made from local tamarisk or pine, were used like notepads by the bureaucracy of Han China. They were bundled with string, stamped with clay seals, and covered in careful brushstrokes. Many were found near the ancient garrison of Yingpan, which guarded the road west of Lulan. Some list items like one horse, white, tethered, T27, jugs of wine, requested for feast, K, 3 men missing from patrol, snow too deep to search. Others are simple: desert wind today, no arrivals. And then, once in a while, one contains a plea to a few rations, request transfer to Dunhuang. Through these fragments, we see Lulan not as a lost city, but as a working border town, dusty, over-administered, full of bored sentries and paperwork. For example, the Han Empire's postal relay system ran through Lulan. Couriers would ride from station to station, handing off letters and grain reports, often traveling 300 kilometers in a single haul. Lulan's location made it a necessary stop, not glamorous, not wealthy, just necessary, and because of this, it was often contested, not by war, but by decree. Asterisk, asterisk. The kingdom's internal leadership changed hands frequently, not always due to murder, like the silk strangling of 77 BCE, but often from quiet diplomatic coercion. When a new king came to power in Shanchan, he was expected to offer tribute to China, and sometimes also to the Zhongnu. When this displeased either side, the punishment wasn't always military. It might be a trade ban, or a denial of silk, or, more ominously, the shifting of a garrison route to keep Lulan compliant. The Han Empire deployed a slow and subtle tool: supply control. Caravans heading west from Dunhuang needed safe watering posts, If Lulan faltered in loyalty, the Han might declare another oasis town as the preferred route, and grain allotments would be redirected. This meant starvation without violence. So, Lulan learned to bend, not break. It took in Chinese officials. It accepted Zhongnu traders. It even hosted Buddhist monks from the east. For a time, Lulan's multilingual nature was not just a curiosity, it was survival. At least 4 scripts were used on its administrative documents: Chinese, Kharosti, from ancient India Brahmi for Buddhist texts, Sogdian, a Central Asian trade language, to function. The kingdom relied not on swords, but on scribes, and yet, this flexibility, too, may have hastened its disappearance. Asterisk, asterisk. In a place like Lulan, no empire ever fully committed. China wanted it as a waypoint, not as a province. The nomads saw it as a stopover, not a capital. And the merchants, for all their reliance on its water, never built temples to Lulan's gods. It was a useful, mutable, necessary city. And that's exactly what made it vulnerable to being forgotten. Take, for instance, the maps. Ancient Chinese maps from the Han Dynasty do include Lulan, but only as a symbol, a dot, a brief annotation: Shanchan, water, and sand. Later, Buddhist pilgrims, like the famous monk Xuanzang, passed through the region in the 7th century on their way to India. But even he, whose records detailed the size of pagodas and the taste of barley porridge, said little of Lulan. It may have already been sand, and so, with each generation, fewer voices recalled the city. A dot became a whisper became a blank space, and the maps moved on. Asterisk, asterisk. The 20th century rediscovery of Lulan happened in parts. The Swedish explorer Sven Hedin found ruins there in 1899. Following local shepherd reports of wood buried in the ground, but it was Oral Stein, the Hungarian-British archaeologist, began proper excavations. He discovered a structure that had once been a beacon tower, likely part of the Han relay network. Inside were the remains of a small, bed platform, cooking ash, and even a cache of wooden documents. They weren't grand. They were reminders of boredom. Tax slips, military reports, doodles, lists. But that, in many ways, was Lulan, a place of practical use, a city that didn't rise in triumph or fall in battle, but existed in service to things passing through. Asterisk, asterisk, yet something about the city haunts the present, more than other forgotten towns, more than other oasis ruins. It may be the mummies, the so-called Lulan beauty and her neighbors, wrapped in simple cloth, interred with shoes and combs, lying in shallow desert graves, or preserved in such incredible detail that they feel not ancient, but paused. Their hair, clothing, and even lice have been studied. One woman had bird feathers stitched into her felt cap. Another was buried with a basket of grain and a leather satchel. One man was wrapped with a bowl, the string still taut. They were not kings or prophets. They were ordinary, and that ordinariness, stilled by salt and time, became more moving than any monument. What if most of history is like this? Not conquest, but quiet transit, not drama, but ration slips and wind. What if the world was once full of Lulan-like kingdoms, logistical, humble, multilingual, whose only mistake was trusting their river would always stay? Asterisk, asterisk. It's easy to forget that the desert was not always desert. Lulan's climate has changed drastically. Pollen records, recovered from the layers beneath its ruins, show traces of tamarisk, reeds, and even walnut. Some scholars suggest the Tarim River changed course multiple times over millennia, and that the Lop Nor alternated between lake, marsh, and dry basin in an unpredictable cycle. So Lulan's fate may not have been a single moment, but a long, drawn-out evaporation. And in a city that had always relied on passing things, caravans, rivers, favored this slow loss of water was the final silence. Its people may not have fallen. They may have simply packed up, one by one. They may have walked east or south, blending into other towns, carrying their ledgers and languages with them, and perhaps in some village far beyond the desert's reach. Their descendants still whispered the name Lulan as part of an old lullaby. By the time Lulan had become a memory, the desert had already started taking it back, not with force or vengeance, but in a way that only deserts know, through patient erosion. The slow shifting of dunes, the disappearance of paths once walked 1,000 times. There was no dramatic fire, no siege, no last cry of rebellion. Just the soundless retreat of people who had once balanced diplomacy, survival, cant, trade in the harsh heart of Central Asia. But perhaps what lingers most, and what makes Lulan more than a footnote, is not that it died. It's how it managed to survive long enough in such an unforgiving place. Asterisk, asterisk. Let's return for a moment to what Lulan looked like in its final living days. Imagine standing on its edge. Its ground beneath your feet is a cracked white crust, not dry earth, but hardened salt from ancient lake beds. A lone tamarisk bush hunches against the wind, and beyond it can see the foundations of a collapsed stupa, weathered smooth like melted wax. To your left, broken wooden posts once formed, part of a home or way station. Some still hold together, the joints visible. It's hand-cut by someone who likely died 15 centuries ago, all around. There's the smell of dust, not the dry dust of a modern attic, but an older kind of scent, mingled with ancient fibers, decayed camel hide, and salt-laden wind. This was the Lulan rediscovered. When Arlstein unearthed the remains in the early 20th century, he did not find palaces. He found fragments of life, a pair of woolen leggings, a broken comb, a sandal carefully tied with twine, a child's cup, and countless wooden slips. Their writing still legible in the desert air. Some slips recorded names: Gong, son of Tian, Administrator Yao, Watchman Leo. Others gave weather reports: sand wind, cold night, visibility poor. Still others asked questions: when will the next grain delivery come? You begin to understand. Lulan was not a mythic city, it was a bureaucratic hub, and in that ordinariness, it tells a story far more interesting than legend. Asterisk, asterisk, but what makes a kingdom disappear so completely from maps? Lulan's decline was partly ecological. The Tarim River, unpredictable and ancient, shifted course. And with this departure went the town's only real source of survival. But the disappearance was also political. After centuries of being tugged between the Han Empire and the Jiannu Confederacy, Lulan had little in the way of lasting independence. Its kings bent easily to the greater powers, and when they were no longer needed, they were replaced, sometimes violently, sometimes diplomatically, but always with an understanding that Lulan was a place through which things passed, not a place that could shape its own fate. It was, in the most poetic sense, a hinge, not a door, as the Silk Road shifted, bypassing the salt-choked basin of Lop Nor in favor of more stable western routes through Kutcha or southward via Dunhuang. Lulan simply fell off the itinerary. There was no outcry, no collapse, only silence. And so, over the centuries, sand and salt crept in, blanketing what was left of its walls, covering its stele, and eventually encasing its people, not in tombs, but in the barest of shallow graves. Ironically, this erasure is what allowed Lulan to be preserved. Asterisk, asterisk, the Lulan mummies, discovered in the late 20th century, are not royalty. They are not priests. They are not warriors. They are just people, and yet their condition is astonishing. The most famous, the Lulan Beauty, is over 3,800 years old, predating the Han era city by millennia, but she was discovered not far from its ruins, preserved with such delicacy that individual eyelashes remain intact. She was found in repose, covered by a simple woolen cloth, with soft leather shoes beside her and a basket of millet tucked near her feet. Her face is delicate, her lips slightly parted, as though mid-sentence. What makes her remarkable isn't just her preservation, but what she tells us she is part of. A wave of Bronze Age people who once roamed this region, long before empires claimed it. DNA tests have linked her and others in the region to Indo-European ancestry, hinting at a migration of peoples long before China or Persia ever looked eastward. This complicates the narrative. Lulan wasn't always Chinese. It wasn't always Central Asian. It was a palimpsest, a canvas layered with many identities over centuries. It was likely settled first by Indo-European herders. Then it absorbed Buddhist monks from India. Then it took in Chinese administrators. Later came Sogdian traders, and perhaps even Persian artisans. Each layer rode over the last, and then the wind wiped the entire canvas clean. Asterisk, asterisk, when scholars debate the disappearance of Lulan, they often argue logistics. The river dried. The Silk Road changed. The kingdom had no defensive walls. Salinization made agriculture impossible. But what if the real cause is simpler? What if Lulan died because it was meant to be temporary? A city built not to last, but to serve a way station. Caravans pause. It lived and breathed only as long as people moved through it, and when they stopped, when traders turned south or west, when monks found safer temples, when soldiers no longer needed a post, Lulan exhaled one last time and vanished. Even today, visiting Lulan is nearly impossible. The region is militarized, remote, swelteringly hostile. But if you were somehow able to walk there, navigating through China's Xinjiang province, following the dry Tarim basin, waiting for the winds to subside, you'd eventually arrive at a land so flat and dead that it almost feels lunar. And there, poking from the salt, might be the edge of a timber beam. or the corner of a tamarisk post, or, if you were especially lucky, a slip of wood bearing 5 faded characters. Winds, delay post. Await instructions. Asterisk, asterisk, in the end. Lulan's story is not about a fall from greatness. It's about the erasure of something that was never meant to be remembered in the first place. It was utilitarian, administrative, tired, hot, and overtaxed. And yet, that's what makes it unforgettable. Because, in Lulan, we don't see the history of kings. We see the history of everyone else. A soldier tracking sandstorms, a scribe waiting for ink, a merchant whose camels need water, a widow buried with her shoes, a child never named on the scrolls, wrapped in reed matting. These are the people who built the Silk Road, not the generals, not the poets, not the emperors. They were the filler of ledgers, the caretakers of timetables, the bearers of sand-laced loads. They didn't shape history. They moved through it, and in doing so, quietly, unknowingly, they kept it going. Asterisk, asterisk, what other cities like Lulan lie buried beneath salt and silence? What stories are still whispering just below the crust of the earth, waiting not for legend, but for someone to notice the absence. When people speak of Persia, of Genghis Khan, Gaul, of Alexander's campaigns through the East, their fingers move across the same lines on maps, bold strokes, tracing conquests, trade, and bloodshed, yet tucked within those lines, often passed over, with little more than a breath, is the word Khwarezm. Strange name, hard to pronounce, it's easy to forget, and perhaps that's why it was forgotten. Khwarezm or Khwarezmia. As the Greeks wrote, it was once one of the most strategically placed kingdoms in Central Asia, located in the fertile delta where the Amu Darya River, once the mighty Oxus, spilled its waters into what used to be the ROC. Khwarezm stood like a stubborn stone in the flow of empires, not large enough to dominate, not weak enough to ignore. And that, as we'll discover, is what doomed it to obscurity. Asterisk, asterisk, before it was a kingdom, Khwarezm was simply an oasis. The land it occupied had no right to exist in such a harsh place, surrounded by deserts, the Karakum to the west and the Kizilkum to the east. It defied geography. Where there should have been salt flats, there were date palms. Where camels should have limped, barley grew instead. The reason was water. The Oxus River fed the land like an artery, bringing glacial melt from the Pamir Mountains and depositing it in long, braided channels that spread across the delta like fingers. These waters, ancient, even in the Bronze Age, gave life to towns, markets, granaries, and temples that would come to define Khwarezm's strange longevity. By 1000 BCE, the region had its own written language. By 500 BCE, it had its own calendar. By 300 BCE, it had already been conquered once by Alexander the Great and survived. Inscriptions found on clay tablets near the old city of Toprakala speak of canals, of taxes, of wine pressed beneath sun-bleached awnings, and of border disputes over irrigation gates. It was, in short, boring. But the survival of boring things, canals, bureaucracies, is often what makes a place last longer than its flashier neighbors. Asterisk, asterisk. Unlike the proud cities of Mesopotamia, Aem was not carved from stone. Its cities were built from sun-dried mud bricks, bound with reeds and silt. It was not a civilization of ziggurats or pyramids. Its most ambitious structures were thick-walled fortresses, called kalas, built to resist desert winds as much as invaders. One of these, Ayaskala, still stands in ghostly silhouette against the desert sky. A massive clay shell perched on a hill, its walls now honeycombed by centuries of erosion, once enclosed a bustling administrative outpost. The view from the top is not grand, it's horizon in every direction. And yet, this was once the frontier of empire. Here, Border guards monitored the passage of good silver from Sogdiana, silk from China, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Caravans passed slowly, leaving behind accounts scratched into wax tablets and fragments of trade contracts preserved in the dust. And every season, the river shifted slightly, and new irrigation channels had to be dug, and new records had to be made. Khwarezm's greatness was not measured in monuments, it was measured in management. Asterisk, asterisk, by the 1st century CE, Khwarezm had grown into a formidable regional power. It minted its own coins, rough discs, stamped with stylized fire altars, reflecting the region's lingering Zoroastrian traditions. It kept scribes, it kept ledgers, kept traditions alive, while the world around it changed empires like garments. Then, around the 8th century, the winds changed. The Islamic Caliphate began to stretch eastward. Khwarezm, caught between Persian and Arab expansion, slowly submitted not with fire, but with formality. Its rulers converted. Its scribes adapted the Arabic script. Cities built mosques alongside older temples. And in doing so, Khwarezm did what it had always done, survived by absorbing what it could not resist. This is the great pattern of forgotten kingdoms. They do not die in glory. They do not scream as they fall. They adapt until they are indistinguishable from those who once threatened them. Asterisk, asterisk, but water is patient, and borders are not. Over the centuries, the Amu Darya, once a gift, became a problem. The river shifted. Some of Khwarezm's canal-fed cities found themselves dry, others drowned in silt, and so, bit by bit, the cities moved. Not migrated, moved. New towns were founded beside old ruins. Toprakala gave way to Kunyarajenj. Fortresses were abandoned and rebuilt slightly eastward, slightly closer to the new river path. It was like watching a ghost walk slowly across the steppe, leaving shell after shell of itself behind. This movement silent, documented, unglamorous as why maps lost track of Khwarezm. Cities with the same name existed miles apart. Borders changed with the river. Kings ruled from shifting capitals. Chroniclers in Baghdad or Bukhara simply stopped trying to track them. It became easier to draw a blank space. Asterisk, asterisk, the arrival of the Seljuks. And later, the Khwarezmian Shahs briefly brought Khwarezm back into view. In the 11th and 12th centuries, it expanded dramatically. Its rulers adopted Persian court culture, patronized scholars, and began to see themselves as heirs to Persian greatness. At its height, Khwarezm extended from the Caspian Sea to the Indus River. Its capital, Gurganj, modern-day Urgench, was a cosmopolitan hub of science, commerce, and theology. It had libraries, it had astronomers, it had poets writing in 3 languages, and it had the misfortune of existing when Genghis Khan decided to send a trade caravan its way. That caravan was robbed, its members executed, and what followed would end Khwarezm's long tradition of survival. But before we speak of its fall, we must pause here at the threshold of its apex. A kingdom that had always bent but never broken now stood tall, confident in its bureaucracy, its canals, its poets, its centuries of quiet endurance. Had it survived Genghis Khan, it might today be remembered as a cornerstone of Central Asian civilization. But instead, it became one of the greatest disappearances in medieval history. Asterisk, asterisk. So here we pause, with Gurganj's libraries still standing, its canals still running clear, its astronomers still peering at the stars through armillary spheres made of bronze. What happens when a kingdom that has always adapted finally faces something it cannot? What does it sound like when centuries of quiet resilience end not in erosion, but in fire? In fire. The year was 1218, a year that began quietly enough in the kingdom of Khwarezm. The canals flowed steadily from the Amu Darya. Markets hummed with the barter of Persian silks, Indian spices, and Chinese ceramics. In Gurganj, the crown jewel of the kingdom's northern heartland, scholars debated astronomy beneath the domes of mud brick libraries. And the brick masons toiled to expand the city walls that now strained to hold back the swelling population. It was, to many, a time of prosperity, a golden moment forged not by conquest or plunder, but by slow, steady trade. The Khwarezmian Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, ruled over an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the foothills of the Hindu Kush. He styled himself King of Kings, a title that resonated with the ghost of Persian emperors past. But prosperity is a delicate thing, especially when it is paired with pride, because far to the east, beyond the Pamirs and across the steppes, another power was rising, quieter, faster, and far more brutal than the scholars of Gurganj could have imagined. Genghis Khan. Asterisk. The story begins with a caravan. Not a large one, some 450 men, most of them merchants and traders, accompanied by camels heavy with silks, dyes, and tools of fine Chinese make. They had come bearing gifts and, more importantly, tribute. Genghis Khan, whose empire had by now unified much of the Mongol steppe, had no interest in directly conquering Khwarezm, not yet. He wanted trade. The caravan crossed the steppes, entered Khwarezmian territory, and arrived at the city of Odra, one of the kingdom's key frontier cities along the Seir Darya River. But something happened there. Something both small and enormous. The governor of Otrar, in a look, accused the caravan of espionage, and then, acting without direct permission from Shah Ala ad-Din, he executed the merchants. Every last one of them. Genghis Khan, in response, sent a diplomatic envoy to reason with the Khwarezmian Shah. He asked that the governor be punished. Instead, Ala ad-Din had one of the Mongol diplomats killed. The others were humiliated. One was reportedly sent back with his beard burned off, a grave insult on the steppe. This was not merely an insult to Mongol pride, it was a declaration of war, and not just war in the traditional sense. What followed was annihilation. Asterisk. In the spring of 1219, Genghis Khan began to move. His generals, including Subotai and Jebe, masters of the terrifyingly mobile Mongol cavalry, began marching westward. But they did not simply take a single route. They fanned out. 4 coordinated armies struck simultaneously across hundreds of kilometers of terrain. They crossed rivers, deserts, and mountains with impossible speed. Cities of Uttra, Bukhara, and Samarkand fell one after the other. Walls were breached with siege engines brought in pieces from China. Wells were poisoned. Survivors, when spared, were enslaved. But what made the Mongol campaign so devastating was not only their military tactics, it was the psychology. They employed terror as a tool of compliance. Cities that resisted were utterly destroyed. Cities that surrendered were spared, for a time. The Khwarezmian cities, confident in their thick mud brick walls, chose to resist. They paid the price. Asterisk. The Shah, now understanding the full weight of what he had provoked, fled. He abandoned his capital at Samarkand and attempted to retreat to the west, moving from fortress to fortress. He died in exile, reportedly on an island in the Caspian Sea, hunted and humiliated. But Genghis Khan was not finished. He had heard of Gurganj. He had heard it was a wealthy city, a jewel beside the river, home to astronomers and merchants, libraries and palaces. And so, in 1221, he sent his sons to raze it to the ground. The siege of Gurganj was long and difficult. The city sat amidst the rivers and canals of the delta, and its marshy terrain made it hard for Mongol cavalry to maneuver. The Mongols, experts at open field battle, found themselves bogged down in the waterlogged soils of Khwarezm's heartland. But they adapted. They diverted the Amu Darya itself, turning it into a weapon. They flooded parts of the city, destroyed dikes and canals, turning Khwarezm's ancient irrigation system into a swampy trap. Eventually, the city fell, and what followed was one of the greatest massacres in medieval history. Estimates vary. Some say 100,000, others suggest many more. The Mongols, known for executing every adult male in a resisting city, left few survivors. Libraries were burned. Markets were looted. The city's intricate records, its centuries of irrigation, maps, and merchant treaties, all vanished beneath the mud and blood. Gurganj was erased, not just defeated, unwritten, in the centuries that followed. Khwarezm never truly recovered. The Delta region, once a thriving hub of canals and trading posts, silted over. The Amu Darya changed course again, this time permanently. The cities that had relied on its flow dried up. The survivors fled, some north to the steppes, others east toward Persia or the newly rising powers of Central Asia. The name Khwarezm remained in pieces. A few surviving dynasts fled to the Indian subcontinent, founding new kingdoms far from the ruins of their ancestors. In the annals of Persian history, the Khwarezmians became a footnote. In the Mongol chronicles, they were remembered only as the fools who had angered the Khan, and in European maps, they simply disappeared. Yet traces remain. Archaeologists working in the region today, particularly at sites like Toperkala, Ayaskala, and Konurgenj, have uncovered baked mud seals with royal insignias, carved bone game pieces, and long-forgotten coinage stamped with fire altars and crescent moons. They have found charred manuscript fragments in collapsed vaults, pieces of astronomical charts that once guided star watches beneath a desert sky. These fragments tell us of a culture that was practical, meticulous, and quietly brilliant, a kingdom that never sought empire, only endurance, a people who did not glorify kings in marble, but instead kept good records of rainfall. And perhaps that's why Khwarezm was so easy to erase from memory, because it did not loudly announce itself. It simply was, until it wasn't. But one must ask, what might Central Asia have become had Khwarezm endured? Would the Silk Road have remained a decentralized network of oasis kingdoms rather than a series of imperial outposts? Would its model of sustainable irrigation and religious tolerance have influenced more than just its neighbors? Was it always doomed by geography, too isolated to rule the world, too tempting to be left alone? When the Mongol horses finally turned away from the flooded bones of Gurganj, there were no songs left to be sung for Khwarezm. The libraries had been turned to ash. The bazaars, once a chattering mosaic of dialects, smells, and silks, were replaced with the silence of ash blowing over canals that no longer flowed. The Amu Darya, diverted so forcefully during the siege, carved a new path, one that never returned to its old channels. Without it, Khwarezm's heartbeat faded. But history doesn't always disappear when cities fall. Sometimes it trickles into other places, into other people. In the decades after Khwarezm's collapse, its survivors scattered like wind-blown seed. Some made their way south to Persia, integrating with the remnants of the Seljuk and Ghaznavid worlds. Others pushed east, merging into the delicate patchwork of kingdoms that would become Mughal India. And some describes, the map makers, the mathematicians, carried fragments of Khwarezm's memory on their backs, in wrapped bundles of parchment and ink. These fragments mattered more than anyone realized. In the 13th century, before the siege of Gurganj, a boy was born in the Khwarezmian city of Kath. His name was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarezmi. You may not know him by that name, but you know the word algorithm? That word comes from the Latinized version of his name, algorithmi, long before the Mongols arrived. Al-Khwarezmi had moved south into the intellectual circles of Baghdad. There, at the famed House of Wisdom, he produced works on algebra, astronomy, and geography that would cross continents in centuries. His book, Kitab al-Jabare wal Muqabala, gave us the term algebra, and his writings on Indian numerals laid the groundwork for the number systems we use today. His name, Khwarizmi, means from Khwarizm. So even as the cities of his homeland were burning, his ideas were traveling westward, preserved by scholars in Baghdad, translated by Andalusians in Spain, and eventually printed in Latin by European thinkers during the Renaissance. The intellectual DNA of Khwarizm survived. That's the strange trick history plays. Kingdoms can fall, rivers can change course, but sometimes it is a single mind that outlasts them all. Asterisk, asterisk. But what of the land itself? Today, the region that was once Khwarizm straddles the borderlands of modern Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, with tendrils stretching into Kazakhstan. The Great Delta is now arid, scarred by the ecological disaster of the Aral Sea's retreat. If you go there, you'll find ruins, not just of Gurganj, but of earlier layers, stacked deep beneath the sand. Cities like Toprakala, with its 2,000-year-old clay walls and painted frescoes of Zoroastrian priests. Fortresses like Ayaskala, sitting on wind-blasted mesas overlooking empty plains. You might see weathered irrigation channels, now filled with dust instead of water. Once part of a hydraulic system so complex that it rivaled anything Rome had built in its prime for centuries. These ruins were little more than shadows. Travelers passed them by, unaware of the kingdom that once pulsed through the delta. The desert is a good place to bury memory, and yet the dust never forgets everything. In the Soviet era, archaeologists began serious excavations of these sites. What they found was not evidence of mere survival, but of sophistication. At Kanyar-Uzhenj, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, they unearthed mausoleums with architectural details that defied expectations, intricate tilework, perfectly aligned, arches, and towers that had withstood centuries of wind and neglect. They found Islamic calligraphy woven into patterns alongside older symbols, suggesting a continuity of culture rather than a break. These were not just border towns, okay? These were centers of scholarship, trade, and administration. In the ancient necropolis, tombs of rulers and poets sit quietly beside each other. Some have names, many do not. Most are empty. It's easy to romanticize ruins, to imagine that something was lost. But in Khwarizm's case, what's more haunting is how much was never properly recorded in the first place. How many poets' names were never etched into stone? How many treatises on astronomy, agriculture, or civic law were burned before they could be copied? How many people simply lived in dyed water carriers, midwives, weavers, and scribes, without ever knowing that their city would vanish from maps altogether? Asterisk. In the 14th century, long after the Mongols had moved on, Temur, known in the West as Tamerlane, rose in Central Asia. He styled himself a new kind of conqueror, part Mongol warlord, part Persian king. When Timur reached the ruins of Gurganj, he ordered what was left to be flattened once more. Hey, he was jealous, according to some accounts, of its former fame. But not even Timur could fully erase the story, because even if the libraries were gone, the memory of Khwarizm endured in whispers in geography books, in medieval Islamic chronicles, in the strange, surviving coins that bore inscriptions in multiple languages, Arabic, Persian, even Sogdian. Khwarizm had been a crossroads, and crossroads are hard to erase. One Persian historian, writing a century later, noted, almost in passing, that the people of Khwarizm could tell time from the bend of a river and knew the month from the taste of the wind. A boring sentence, a beautiful one. It tells you that these people did not see themselves as trapped by empires. They measured life by the water's curve, by the way barley grew in spring, by the dust on the apricot trees. They lived quietly, enduring droughts and floods, kings and invaders, until they didn't. And even now, as the region grapples with the scars of Soviet-era cotton farming, canals are redug and cities, like Urgench, build monuments to the past. The legacy of Khwarezm survives, not in banners or legends, but in the way the land still resists, still waits. Asterisk, asterisk. So when we speak of forgotten kingdoms, those that vanished from maps, we must remember that some were not truly forgotten, just too quiet for the loud voices of history. Khwarezm did not shout. It irrigated, it calculated, it scribbled, came till the flood came. And even then, even after all that ruin, the name survived, not in stone, but in every algorithm we now run. Every number we balance. Every equation we solve. What else, you might wonder, has quietly survived from kingdoms we thought were gone? And how many are still waiting beneath the dust for someone to ask the right question? Before maps drew borders with ink, and before nations printed flags into memory, there was a land that lived in the spaces between. Not quite east, not quite west, not Persian, not fully Chinese. So Gdiana. It stretched across the Zhovushan River Valley in the high plains of what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. But Sogdiana was not a kingdom in the way you might imagine an imperial throne that lasted long. No single dynasty that defined it. It was instead a corridor, a habit of survival, a language of trade. If you had walked into one of its cities around 300 CE, perhaps into Samarkand or Bukhara, you would not have felt you were in a kingdom at all. You would have been in a marketplace of voices: Persian, Sogdian, Chinese, Sanskrit, and Greek. You would have seen silk from Chang'an, glassware from Syria, and ivory combs from India. A carved seal from a Sogdian merchant once listed 7 scripts he could read. He was not exceptional. He was just prepared, because to survive here on the edge of every empire, you had to speak many tongues, and none too loudly. Sogdiana's role in history was never to conquer, but to connect. They were the invisible thread between empires, the reliable link between oaths and goods. Their merchant caravans threaded across deserts and mountains long before Marco Polo dreamed of the Silk Road. Their letters, written in careful Sogdian script, had been found from Mongolia to the Black Sea. They had no need to raise armies. They carried news. But where, then, did they vanish? That story begins slowly, almost imperceptibly, as stories of disappearance often do. Not with conquest, but with the change of hands. The silk routes began to shift. The Tang dynasty, once eager to receive envoys from Samarkand, found itself preoccupied with rebellions and court intrigue. The Sassanid Persians, who had once welcomed the Sogdians as go-betweens, fell under pressure from the expanding Arab Caliphate, and Sogdiana, the quiet conduit, was squeezed. Asterisk, asterisk, but rewind the scene. Let's go back a few centuries before the disappearance to a moment when Sogdiana was not just surviving, but quietly thriving. The year is 500 CE. The world is in flux. In the West, the Roman Empire has split, and the Eastern Byzantines watch nervously as Slavic and Hunnic migrations push into their borders. In the South, the Gupta Empire of India begins to fragment, leaving behind temples but no successors. And in the East, the Chinese dynasties teeter between chaos and unification. And there, between them, lie the Sogdians, watching, trading, waiting. Their capital, Samarkand, is a jewel in the steppe city of mud brick homes and turquoise tiles, Zoroastrian fire temples, and bustling dye workshops. Its streets are not grand, but busy. Not monumental, but meaningful. If you follow the smoke rising from its bakeries, you'd find flatbreads studded with sesame, carried in wide woven baskets by children with purple-stained hands from plums, sold at the corner stall. In this city, time is marked not by the crowning of kings, but by the return of caravans. A merchant gone for 3 years is a short journey. 5 is typical. 7 is expected. These merchants are not nomads. They are not conquerors. They are cosmopolitan, survivalist, skilled in managing both weather and egos. When they travel to Chang'an, they wear robes of stiff brocade, bowing low in Chinese fashion. When they cross into Persian territory, they burn incense to Anahita and quote lines of Avestan verse. In India, they trade not just goods, but riddles, because a good riddle can build more trust than gold. They are middlemen, yes, but not in the pejorative sense. They are the ones who understand the rules of every empire and belong fully to none. And that is what makes them so easy to forget. A Sogdian family archive, discovered buried near Dunhuang in China, contains letters from a woman named Milne. She writes to her brother, begging for help. Her husband is gone. Her rations are cut. She has no silver. Tone is desperate but composed. She signs off not with tears, but with a record of the remaining inventory she's kept. My father's leather belt, 1 spoon, and a small lamp still working. That letter, written in the early 4th century, is now one of the oldest examples of Sogdian prose we possess. It is not a royal edict. It is not a battlefield report. It is a woman's complaint from exile, and yet it is through this letter that we understand what the Sogdian world really was: a network of families, its messengers in fragile trust, woven tighter than the silk they carried. A world where fortunes disappeared over sand dunes, when ill-timed blizzard in the Tian Shan Mountains could mean the loss of 2 years' income, where messages, like Manet's, had arrived long after the problem was solvable, and still they endured. By the 6th century, Sogdian colonies dotted the Silk Road from Merv to Luoyang. Their influence grew not by strength of arms, but by reliability. Chinese emperors referred to them with bureaucratic precision. The people who know the roads. That was their identity. It's not a nation, not a tribe, could function. But what happens when roads change? It's asterisk, the collapse of Sogdiana was not a moment. It was a murmur, a shift in wind, as the Islamic Caliphate expanded eastward in the 7th and 8th centuries. It absorbed the lands of former Persian control, including the Sogdian cities. Many resisted. Samarkand held out. Bukhara revolted. There were battles. Yes, one famous leader, Devashtik, was crucified in the city square of Mount Mug, trying to defend what was left of the old order. But war was not what undid Sogdiana. It was translation. Over the next 2 centuries, Arabic replaced Sogdian as the language of record. New coinage, new scripts, new prayers. The merchants adapted. They learned Arabic. They cited the Quran. They changed the greetings in their letters. But something else faded. Not the people, but the idea of being Sogdian. They merged into other identities: Persian, Turkic, Arab. Their cities remained. Their descendants prospered. But their name slipped away. When the great geographer Ali Idrisi compiled his maps in the 12th century, Samarkand was still there, but Sogdiana was not. It had no borders to defend, no dynasty to cite. It had, like so many intermediaries, been absorbed by the very empires it had once connected. Asterisk, and yet. Here's the strange part. In the heart of ancient Chang'an, Tang dynasty tomb was discovered, belonging to a Sogdian nobleman named An Bei. He had been a merchant, an official, a foreigner who had found status in China. His tomb murals, though, painted in Chinese style, depict feasting scenes, unmistakably Central Asian dancers in wide-sleeved robes, drinking bowls raised, faces turned westward. He was buried far from Sogdiana, but the desert did not erase him. His language, Sogdia, was inscribed on the tombstone. One last sentence, one last name. And that is how we begin this story, not with a fall, but with a letter. a tomb, and the sound of footsteps in a city that was never theirs, but always belonged to them. What changed, we might ask, in the silence that followed. By the time the Arab Caliphate pushed into Transoxiana in the 700s, the Sogdians were already well acquainted with the art of adapting. They had done it for centuries, blending in with whichever empire held sway over the valleys and trade routes they called home. To the east, they had bowed before the Thames. To the west, they had toasted under the moonlight with Persian satraps. Now, they faced the rise of Islam, and like before, they listened. And they adjusted. But something was different now, because the arrival of the Arabs was not merely a new banner flying above the watchtower, nor just new taxes levied on the caravans that slipped through desert passes. It was a deeper shift, linguistic, spiritual, cultural. It wasn't that the Sogdians were conquered. It was that the world they had helped weave with trade routes and letters was unraveling, and the thread was slipping from their hands. To understand this slow unspooling, you must picture a place like Panjikent, a once vibrant Sogdian town nestled in what is now Tajikistan. At its peak, it bustled with scribes, tailors, fire priests, and ceramicists. It had grand homes with courtyards and two-story walls decorated with rich mural scenes of epic myths, banquets, and wrestlers with thick forearms and smiling faces. But the murals tell more than just joy. In one, Sogdian nobleman kneels, head bowed before a faceless figure dressed in a foreign style, perhaps a conqueror. In another, a caravan is caught in a sudden sandstorm, camels half submerged in gusts. The expression on the lead trader's face is unreadable. Panjikent, like many such towns, did not fall in a battle written about in chronicles. It faded. Its citizens migrated. Its temples crumbled and were buried in Loas. What remained? The murals. The forgotten ... As Arab rule took hold, new languages began to dominate. Arabic became the language of the courts and records. Persian, revived in its Islamicized form, began to dominate poetry and philosophy. The Sogdian script, once carved onto merchant seals and painted along the corridors of temples, was no longer the script of power. It wasn't banned, simply stopped being useful. When survival is at stake, cataclysm trumps pride. Sogdian families began adopting Arabic names. Tax records from the late 700s show fathers named Shapur and Mir changing to Muhammad and Ali. Fire temples, once tended daily with strict Zoroastrian rituals, were quietly abandoned, or, in some places, converted into mosques. The Sogdian language persisted in some form, but more often as a kitchen tongue spoken in homes, unrecorded, slowly dissolving into the dialects around it. And yet, they did not vanish all at once. Some clung to identity in strange ways. In parts of China, where Sogdian communities had settled generations before, they preserved small rituals. Tomb inscriptions from this era contain hybrid scripts, part Sogdian, part Chinese. The dead were buried with both Buddhist and Zoroastrian symbols, just in case. They were hejbats, prayers in two directions. Back in Central Asia. Another wave approached. The Turks. By the 9th century, the region saw a shift in political gravity. The Abbasid Caliphate's control began to fray, and new powers emerged like the Samanid Empire, which ruled from Bukhara and spoke Persian, but carried the torch of Islamic culture forward. Turkic tribes were migrating, settling, forming confederations. They were not new to the region. Sogdians had traded with Turks for centuries, but now the Turks were not passing through. They were building, and in building their world, they brought with them their languages, their expectations, and their own vision of Central Asia. The Sogdians, ever adaptable, adjusted again. Those who remained integrated into Turkic courts. Some became advisors, scholars, court poets, but the terms of participation had changed. They were no longer the hosts. They were guests, in a room they had once furnished. Asterisk, asterisk, there is an Arabic geographer, Ibn Khordadbeh, who wrote a peculiar note around the year 870 in his book of Roads and Kingdoms. He describes a group of Sogdian merchants who still operated caravans from Central Asia to China. He marvels that they knew multiple languages of Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, Chinese. He notes this with admiration. But even as he records it, you can sense the curiosity, even disbelief, as though he were describing the last of an endangered species. And perhaps he was, because by then, the world had changed again. The Silk Road, so long a highway of faiths, goods, and rumors, was shifting underfoot. Maritime routes, safer and faster, began to rise. Chinese porcelain and Indian spices no longer needed camels and careful diplomacy to cross into Basset ports. They needed ships and sea winds. The central role of the overland merchant faded, and with it, the Sogdian calling card. Asterisk, asterisk, but this doesn't mean nothing was left behind. In the caves of Dunhuang, on the edge of the Gobi Desert, lie the most accidental libraries in history. For centuries, Buddhist monks had stored scrolls, letters, and scriptures in hidden niches. When they were sealed away in the 11, it was in the caves of Dunhuang, specifically Cave 17, sometimes called the Library Cave, that the forgotten words of the Sogdians resurfaced after centuries of silence. Thousands of documents had been walled in and forgotten by the 11th century, only to be rediscovered in the early 1900s by a Hungarian-British explorer named Errol Stein. The documents were written in a kaleidoscope of languages: Chinese, Sanskrit, Old Turkish, Tibetan, and, notably, Sogdian. Letters, contracts, Buddhist sutras, receipts for horse fodder, fragments of lives. The kind of documents people don't preserve because they're sacred, but because they're practical. Because they matter just long enough. And yet, the Sogdian papers in Dunhuang survived because someone, centuries earlier, had gathered everything, even the scraps, and walled them in. Not for posterity, likely for storage or ritual, or perhaps simply because there was nowhere else to put them. One of the most remarkable of these documents is the so-called ancient letters, a set of Sogdian correspondences dating back to around 313 CE, centuries before the rise of Islam, found in a crumbling tower along the Chinese frontier. They were written by Sogdian merchants living in exile in the Chinese city of Luoyang. Their letters are personal, painful, and matter-of-fact. They speak of homesickness, family debts, grain shortages, and failing marriages. In one, a woman named Mimne writes to her husband Ninite, accusing him of abandoning her while he sought fortune in the East. A voice sharp, vulnerable, and tired emerges from the centuries like a whisper from behind a paper wall. You have written me no letter since you left. I am ill. If you do not come, I will die alone in a foreign land. She never received a reply. These are not tales of generals or kings. These are the echoing murmurs of a people who carried civilizations in their ledgers and contracts. Asterisk, asterisk, by the 10th century. The Sogdian language was mostly gone from official records. Persian had become the lingua franca of literature and administration. In Central Asia, Arabic reigned in religion and law. Sogdian lived on only in liturgies of dwindling Zoroastrian communities and, curiously, in a few words borrowed into the dialects of distant lands. But the language had left seeds. One of its more obscure descendants was the Bactrian language, which faded not long after. Another was the mysterious Yagnobi language, spoken today by a small number of people in the Yagnobi Valley of Tajikistan. Linguists believe it is the closest living relative of Sogdianan, orphaned dialect tucked between mountain folds, surviving despite everything. The Yagnobi people do not claim a grand historical lineage. Their children herd sheep. Their elders wear patchwork coats against the wind. But their words, shaped by isolation and frost. Echo, with syntax that once charted routes across the Taklamakan desert. Asterisk history tends to remember empires that leave behind stone temples, choose fortresses. The Sogdians left behind language, paper, paint, contracts, and most of that given enough time disintegrates. But some stories remain, because other people recorded them. And here, the Chinese played a quiet role in preserving what the world otherwise forgot. The Thames dynasty, which ruled China during the Sogdians' golden era, saw them not merely as foreigners, but as necessary conduits. Official documents describe Hu merchants, a term that often referred to Central Asians trading camels for tea, glassware for silk, and stories for protection. In court paintings and funeral art, Sogdian envoys are shown with thick beards, high hats, and embroidered robes, holding gifts and bowing with deliberate care. There's one, stele in Xi'an, carved in 742 CE, commemorating a Sogdian named An Bei. It's written in both Chinese and Sogdian, and it reads more like a neighborhood obituary than a grand epitaph. An Bei, it says, was diligent, respectful, and fond of drinking wine with his friends. He honored his parents. He did not cause trouble. It's not the kind of inscription you'd expect for a merchant who once navigated empires, but perhaps that's what makes it memorable. It captures the stillness between the caravans. Asterisk, archaeologists today still uncover Sogdian relics, far from Central Asia glass beads in Japan, silver bowls in Sweden, coins in Afghanistan. Some were traded, others looted. A few were passed hand to hand by people who forgot what the inscriptions meant. One, Sogdian Assyrian ornate bone container found near Samarkand bears a carving of two birds perched on a fruit tree. Below it, an inscription, praise for the soul of someone named Farnsogd. Histing means Sogdian glory. He died without fanfare, but his remains were placed in a container carved with care. It's the sort of burial that suggests quiet wealth, a belief in the afterlife, to cultural memory that lingered even as the world moved on. Asterisk, by the 13th century, the Mongols had swept across Central Asia. Cities like Bukhara, once home to hybrid Sogdian communities, were devastated. The final remnants of Sogdian identity scattered or folded into new ethnicities. Turkicization, already underway, accelerated. What the Arabs had begun with script and law, the Mongols finished with fire and displacement. And yet, even here, the Sogdians adapted. Some became translators in Mongol courts. They served as intermediaries between distant Chinese provinces and Mongol administrators. They knew the old roots. They understood negotiation. It was the last flicker of their ancient role. When Marco Polo passed through the region in the late 13th century, he did not mention the Sogdians. By then, the name had all but vanished. But if he spoke to a guide in Samarkand, or listened to a merchant haggle over lapis lazuli near the Oxus, he may have heard a faint echo of it, a proverb, a phrase, a certain accent when saying the word. For silk, asterisk today, the region once known as Sogdiana is split among multiple countries: Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, parts of Kyrgyzstan. Its ancient capital, Samarkand, is a city of domes and tile, known more for Timur than for traders. The language of the street is Uzbek. The script is Latin. Few locals have heard the name Sogdian, but archaeologists, linguists, and historians continue to piece the story back together. They catalog the documents from Dunhuang. They trace the shape of forgotten letters. They visit the caves, the ossuaries, the mural-covered ruins where forgotten people once traded not just goods, but meaning. Asterisk. And so the question remains, can a civilization survive if it leaves no armies, no palaces, no blood-soaked chronicles? Or is it in the quiet persistence of words muttered in back rooms, whispered into foreign scripts, plated across ages that memory finds its most reliable home? The Sogdians might never answer. But perhaps that was always the point. They were never meant to be remembered as conquerors, only as connectors, and the threads they wove between tongues, between cultures, between forgotten towns, still hum beneath the surface of history, waiting for someone to listen. Long before the word Khwarezm slipped from the tongues of kings and into the footnotes of forgotten geography, it was a whisper on the edge of the Oxus River, name carried by desert winds and marsh birds. Situated in what is now western Uzbekistan and northern Turkmenistan, the kingdom of Khwarezm, also spelled Khwarezm or Khwarezmia, grew not in the center of empires, but at their margins between Persia, the nomadic steppes, and the fertile rivers of Transoxiana. The name itself, Khwarezm, means little to most today, and yet, in its time, it was home to scholars, scribes, and one of the most quietly advanced societies of the medieval Islamic world. You've ever heard of the algorithm, you've already touched Khwarezm, because it was here that Muhammad Ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi was born, mathematician, astronomer, and the man whose name would later become al-Khwarizmi. But we are not starting with al-Khwarizmi, not yet. He is a chapter of Khwarezm's history, brilliant, yes, but not the whole. We began earlier when the kingdom was not yet a kingdom, but a string of oases stitched together by irrigation and memory before Islam. Before the Arabs arrived with books and law, Khwarezm was Zoroastrian. Its people built mud brick fortresses above floodplains, worshipped at fire temples, and wrote in a script that has not fully survived. The kingdom thrived not through force, but through geography. To the north lay the steppes, roamed by Scythians and later Turks. To the south, the Persian world. Between them, Khwarezm acted as a filter, quiet sieve for ideas, goods, and people. For much of its early history, Khwarezm remained on the periphery of greater empires. The Achaemenids may have claimed it, though their control was light. Later, it became part of the Parthian sphere, then the Sasanian. Each empire left behind fragments, coins, pottery, architectural motifs, but Khwarezm remained Khwarezm. It had its own language, its own script, and, crucially, its own obsession, knowledge. You must imagine a world where the act of writing was sacred. In the city of Kath, near the delta of the Amu Darya, scribes copied not prayers but treatises on medicine, astronomy, and law. Theirs was not a literary culture in the way we think of stories and poems. It was a documentary culture. What mattered was not the drama of kings, but the rules of irrigation canals, the weight of grains, the recording of eclipses. Somewhere around the 6th century, Khwarezm began to formalize its rule. A dynasty emerged, one that balanced deference to greater powers with local autonomy. The rulers were not titled shahs or sultans, but Khwarezmis, shahs. This term, more administrative than regal, suggests how the region viewed power as something to be exercised responsibly, not gloriously. Kingdom of accountants, not conquerors. When Islam spread across Central Asia in the 7th and 8th centuries, Khwarezm resisted. Conversion came slowly and not without tension. Arab generals marched through, sometimes burning, sometimes persuading. But the scribes of Khwarezm did not disappear. They adapted. Instead of Zoroastrian rituals, they recorded hadith. Instead of ancient Khwarezmian, they wrote in Arabic and Persian. But behind the new veneer, the same methodical mind persisted, a compulsion to preserve, catalog, and understand. By the 9th century, Khwarezm was no longer peripheral. It had become a crossroads for intellectual life. This was the age of al-Khwarizmi, who worked not in Khwarezm, but in the Abbasid court in Baghdad, where scholars gathered under the patronage of caliphs, who believed learning itself was divine. Al-Khwarizmi's treatise on algebra, al-Kitab, al-Muqtasar, v. Hisab, algebra, Wam Kabbalai, the groundwork for what we now call equations. His work on geography included a revised version of Ptolemy's map. His astronomical tables were translated into Latin centuries later and used in medieval Europe. But through all this, he was known as Al-Khwarizmi, the man from Khwarizm. Filed, etched into his name, followed him into history. Even as the world changed, Khwarizm's attachment to scholarship persisted. During the 10th and 11th centuries, the region passed under various overlords, first the Samanids, then the Ghaznavids. Each new ruler took the city, demanded tribute, and moved on. But the scribes remained. They continued writing medical manuals, continued mapping the stars, continued documenting rainfall and harvests, and laws that dated back to times when the world had no name for the place they lived. Then, in the 12th century, something changed. The Khwarezm declared independence, no longer content to be a borderland. The dynasty took control of greater territory. The capital moved to Gurganj, modern-day Konyaganj, and the rulers began building what would become a short-lived but brilliant empire stretching across Iran, Afghanistan, and parts of Central Asia. In this new phase, Khwarezm was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and surprisingly resilient. Its rulers, though Turkic in origin, patronized Persian culture. Scholars, artisans, and engineers came to Gurganj. It was called the City of 1,000 Domes. Marco Polo never visited, but others spoke of it as the jewel of the steppe. And, at the heart of this flowering, libraries, Gurganj's scribes, inheriting centuries of bureaucratic precision, compiled archives that blended law, theology, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. The kingdom became a quiet rival to Baghdad and Bukhara. Its fame grew, but with growth came danger to the east. The storm was rising. The Mongols, led by Genghis Khan. They had begun their conquests with surgical precision, toppling kingdoms that had stood for centuries. And as they approached Khwarezm, they sent a message. A trade caravan arrived, peaceful, filled with goods. The Khwarezm Shaila, ad-Din Muhammad II, had the caravan detained. Suspecting them of espionage, he ordered their execution. Genghis Khan responded with diplomacy. He sent 3 envoys to the Khwarezm Shah, demanding accountability. The Shah had one of them executed. He shaved the beards of the others and sent them back. It was a mistake the world would not forget. Genghis Khan, who had rarely been personally insulted, launched a campaign of vengeance in Khwarezm, the scribal kingdom. The place of domes and dust-covered books stood directly in his path. The libraries would not survive, not intact, not entirely. But what happened next was not a mere sacking. It was a firestorm, methodical, merciless, and remembered with terror even in Mongol records. Yet, before we speak of the fall, we must pause here, because it is important to dwell, for just a moment longer, on what was lost. How many pages? How many stars were mapped? How many cures for illnesses? How many lives lived entirely in the margins of scrolls that were rolled up and burned? And if a civilization records itself only on paper, what happens when that paper turns to ash? The Mongols came not just for the palaces, but for the record dashkeepers. So we ask, can you erase a kingdom, not by conquest, but by incinerating its memory, its memory? The Mongols did not come as a single wave. They came like a tide first scouts, then generals, and finally a deluge of hooves and smoke. In 1219, Genghis Khan launched his full assault on the Khwarezmian Empire. He did not bring poets or scribes. He brought siege engineers, hardened warriors, and a memory for insult. Khwarezm had been wealthy, but it was not prepared. Its cities were scattered, each governed with local autonomy under a central rule that had only recently become truly imperial. Genghis knew this. He exploited the disunity. City by city, fortress by fortress, the Mongols advanced. Bukhara fell. Samarkand followed. The Shah fled, abandoning his subjects, seeking refuge along the Caspian Sea. He would die there, ill and ashamed, leaving behind a disoriented kingdom and a stunned bureaucracy that had, till then, recorded every rainfall and every coin minted dot. And so the capital Gurg and stood alone, situated near the Amu Darya Delta, surrounded by canals and wetlands. Gurganj was not an easy city to conquer. The Mongols would later say it was one of the most difficult battles they had fought, but they did not give up. Genghis sent his sons to take the city, and after bitter fighting, they did. What happened next has become part of historical echo. The destruction of Gurganj is not remembered for its strategy, but for its completeness. Chroniclers Persian, Arab, and even Mongol describe the massacre with words that seemed to falter before the scale. Some claimed the canals were choked with corpses. Others said the river ran red for days. These may be exaggerations, but not by much. The Mongols, when angered, made examples. They spared engineers, masons, and translators, occasionally a physician, but libraries, archives, astronomers. These were not assets to a mobile empire. Gurganj had been a center of quiet intellect. Its loss was not just of buildings or people, but of continuity. Courts that had survived dynasties were reduced to ash. Manuals on irrigation systems, legal codes, medical treatises, copied for generations all gone, and with them, the names of those who wrote them. Think of what a scribe must have seen in those final days. Shelves emptied, walls scorched, scrolls unrolling in the wind like discarded thoughts. The Mongols were not irrational. They understood the power of knowledge, but their empire valued oral memory, not written bureaucracy. Their system depended on loyalty and conquest, not administrative record-keeping. So, to them, Gurganj's greatness was not just irrelevant, it was dangerous. A center of knowledge could breed resistance, so it was erased. But here is the strangest part. Some survived in the aftermath of the destruction. Fragments of Khwarezm's culture lived ungnawed in its capital, but in those who fled, scholars and engineers who escaped the siege made their way to safer cities. Some traveled to Baghdad. Others found their way into India, Persia, and even China. The Mongol Empire, ironically, became the vehicle for the dispersal of Khwarezm's remaining intellectuals. And it is in these quiet migrations that the ghost of Khwarezm lingers. One example is Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, philosopher and theologian, whose work influenced Islamic thought for centuries. Though not born in Khwarezm, his teachers and peers drew from his traditions. Another is Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who would later establish observatories and advise Mongol rulers on scientific matters, preserving what little remained of pre-invasion astronomical work. Even in the Yuan dynasty courts of China, there were scholars who bore the suffix al-Khwarizmi long after Gurganj had been flattened, but the kingdom itself never recovered. After the fall of Gurganj, the Khwarezmian dynasty continued in name only. Kela Adin, son of the defeated Shah, fled to India and tried to carve out a new domain, but he never reclaimed his homeland. His story became that of a tragic wanderer, admired for bravery, pitied for futility. Khwarezm, the kingdom, dissolved, and over time, even the land forgot. The Amu Darya shifted its course, as great rivers sometimes do. The once bustling region, dried canals cracked and filled with sand. Cities were buried not by time alone, but by silt and silence. When archaeologists returned centuries later, they did not find libraries. They found shards, foundations, the burnt outlines of buildings. In one case, they found a series of clay seals that suggested documents had once been stored here in vast quantities. But the documents themselves were gone. No archives, no catalog, just the faint echo of a vanished bureaucracy. And still, the world uses a word that carries their legacy algorithm, because even though the scrolls are dust, tame, al-Khwarizmi remains printed in every computer science textbook, every mathematical reference, every explanation of logic-based processes. This, perhaps, is the most enduring irony. Khwarizm was destroyed not because it was weak, but because it was orderly. Its scribes, trained in a tradition of recording and refining, became the bearers of knowledge that outlived the state itself. When the Mongols destroyed the source, they could not fully extinguish the ripples. There's something quiet and human about that. Not heroic, not grand. Just persistent, like a notation in the margin of a lost book. One of the few fragments we have from Khwarezmian writing before the Mongol invasions describes the construction of an irrigation channel. It includes no metaphor, no praise of kings, precise measurements, water flow rates, and a calculation of seasonal output. It is, if one can say such a thing, boring, and that is what makes it so valuable, because for every sword raised in conquest, there was someone measuring the depth of a trench, someone drawing a map, someone deciding which season was best for barley. These people rarely appear in our histories, but they made civilization possible. So what do we make of Khwarezm? A kingdom that never conquered Europe, capital that no longer exists, a language that disappeared before it could be fully recorded, and yet a place that gave the world a new way to think. Perhaps we did not need monuments to remember them. Perhaps remembering that they once recorded rainfall is enough, but it leaves a question unanswered. How many other Khwarezms have we forgotten kingdoms, erased not by war, but by the loss of their librarians? By the time the dust settled over Khwarezm and the last smoldering fragments of Gurgenj had cooled, something peculiar had begun to unfold, something quiet and nearly invisible. For in the absence of kings, scribes, and courts, the land itself remained, and buried beneath layers of river silt and drifting desert sands. It kept secrets, not the kind of secrets you find in dramatic histories. No conspiracies or sacred relics, just the quiet persistence of things once considered mundane: foundations of canal walls, roof tiles etched with geometric lines, and small pieces of glazed pottery discarded in courtyards where no one lived anymore. For centuries, these remnants were left untouched, ignored by passing armies and resettled populations who no longer remembered the names of the cities below their feet. The very land that had once sustained Khwarezm, its fertile deltas, its ingenious irrigation, had become a barrier to memory. The Mu Darya, like time itself, had shifted course, leaving the ruins stranded far from human concern. But memory, like water, always finds a way to seep back through. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that archaeologists, mostly Russian, began to realize that the plains of modern-day Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan were riddled with clues. Scholars like Sergei Tolstov, leading the Khwarezm archaeological ethnographic expedition, ventured into the region, armed not with swords, but with notebooks, sketchpads, and brushes. What they found was less a city than a fingerprint. Traces of brickwork, pieces of collapsed minarets, and shards of ceramic vessels offered no full story, but hints. Khwarezmian script, long extinct, appeared in faint, worn inscriptions. In some cases, bones were found buried in communal graves, their positioning suggesting hurried burials, as if the dead had been too numerous or too urgent to treat with ceremony. There were no triumphal inscriptions, no glorifying murals, only the weight of routine. Storage jars that had once held grain, blackened cooking stones, broken pens from scribes' desks. These fragments suggested not a civilization obsessed with conquest, but one focused on record-keeping, farming, measuring rainfall, civilization whose greatest ambition may have been simply to endure. One of the more remarkable discoveries from the expedition was a set of brick-lined irrigation basins near what was once the edge of Gurgenj. Based on sediment analysis, these basins had been flushed and maintained regularly, likely for centuries. and yet there were no names attached to them. No designer commemorated in stone. Whoever built and maintained those canals, whoever aligned them with the seasons, calculated their gradients, assured their operation during floods, left no record beyond the utility of their work. And perhaps that is the most profound kind of legacy, infrastructure that outlives memory. The more the archaeologists uncovered, the more they began to understand that Khwarezm had not been a kingdom of spectacle, but one of subtlety. It had valued stability over glory, rhythm over monumentality. Its greatest achievements were not battles won, but calendars kept, taxes collected, and water moved quietly from river to field. These may not sound like the stuff of legends, but they are what allow human life to persist. Still, the silence lingered. After the initial expeditions, the field of Khwarezmian study remained a niche interest, while the histories of Rome, Egypt, and China were retold endlessly. Khwarezm remained in footnotes, accessible mainly through dry academic monographs or Soviet excavation reports. Even the name Khwarezm began to fade from use, replaced by regional or political terms, Karakopakstan, Khiva, Kanyurjanj. The places remained, but their story was fragmented, except for one strange echo, the persistence of the word algorithm. As mentioned earlier, it comes from Al-Khwarizmi, the scholar born in this region centuries before its fall. He lived under Abbasid rule in Baghdad. His nisba, his geographical surname, was a marker of origin, and even as Khwarezm itself fell into ruin, the algorithms that now shape our daily lives carry its name. But consider this for a moment. How many of those who speak of algorithms today know that the word carries with it the dust of a forgotten delta? How many programmers, students, or theorists realize that every time they speak the word, they echo a kingdom erased, not by time, but by fire? The silence of Khwarezm is not just about what was lost, it's about what was overwritten. When the Mongols destroyed Gurganj, they did not merely destroy a city, they interrupted a chain of memory. Generations of scribes, merchants, irrigation managers, and astronomers were severed from the knowledge they inherited. The things they measured, eclipses, canal flow continued, but the practice of recording them in Khwarezmian hands ceased, and so a civilization did not end in fire alone. It ended in forgetting, which brings us back to the quiet tragedy of all lost kingdoms. They are rarely lost in a single moment, not by a sword, nor a flame, nor even an earthquake. They are lost when the records go unread, when no one copies the scroll, when the calendar's start date is no longer known. Sometimes the most violent destruction is not physical but bureaucratic. And so today, Khwarezm exists in fragments, in the sand-covered bricks of Kanyurjanj, in the fading inscriptions that line the unused paths along the delta, in museum boxes labeled with untranslatable script, in academic papers no one reads anymore, and yes, in the whispered syllables of algorithm. It exists in silence, but there is something comforting in that, too, because even if no one remembers the names of the canal diggers or the scribes who inked the rainfall records, their work shaped the world, quietly, persistently, without glory. Perhaps that's the deepest kind of survival. So the next time you scroll through a digital map, run a sort function, or adjust a GPS setting, pause, not for the technology, but for the ghost of a kingdom that once kept time by water and stars, and ask yourself, **, how many other forgotten systems are still guiding us, quietly, from beneath the sand? If you find yourself staring at a map of Central Asia, somewhere near the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, you'll come across a name that feels almost accidental. Lulan, just a scatter of syllables, tucked near the faded paths of the Silk Road, on a plain so dry that entire cities can vanish beneath a crust of wind-blown sand. Lulan does not shout from history. It whispers today. The word survives in archaeological circles, a topic of sparse academic conferences, and the occasional expedition report from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. But 2,000 years ago, the land was a node, small but critical passage in the network of trade and diplomacy that connected Rome, India, Persia, and the Han Dynasty of China. Luland was not grand. It was not fortified like the great cities of Mesopotamia, nor adorned with monumental statues like Alexandria. It had no towering walls or sweeping canals. Instead, it existed more like a way station. It had mud brick walls to keep out dust storms, and narrow streets where traders shuffled past each other in the morning chill. The city's earliest mentions appear in Han Dynasty chronicles. Around 176 BCE, Lulan was described as a small polity, with a king who submitted tribute to the Han court. For the Chinese, Lulan was part of the western frontier, its thread to be woven into the vast imperial fabric that stretched across the steppes and deserts. But this submission was never permanent. Lulan switched allegiances frequently, playing a cautious game between the Chinese to the east and the nomadic Jiannu to the north. Its location was both its strength and its doom. Lulan sat near Lap Nur, a shifting salt lake fed by the Tarim River. This lake was erratic, prone to drying up, expanding, and then disappearing entirely. But when full, it nourished the reed beds and supported enough agriculture for Lulan to grow grain, dates, and millet. Caravans would pause there. Camels would drink. Scrolls and silks would be inspected, counted, sealed, and sent forward. For a time, Lulan held a measure of influence out of proportion with its size, simply because it controlled the routes. But this kind of importance is fragile. It relies on external need. When geopolitical winds shift, the value of a city like Lulan can be reduced to a patch of dust. We know so little about the daily life of Lulan's people. They did not leave behind chronicles. Their tombs, discovered in the 20th century, contained no golden crowns, but rather shoes, combs, needles, and clay pots. In one grave, a perfectly preserved woolen cap was found dyed in rich red and stitched with care. Another corpse, that of a young woman, still bore her eyelashes, protected by the desert's dry embrace. These are the remnants, not of grandeur, but of continuity. People who woke, farmed, washed, and slept, day after day, in the shadow of imperial ambitions that passed through and moved on. Lulan became a protectorate of the Han Dynasty in 77 BCE after a brutal intervention. The Han diplomat, Fu Jizi, famously assassinated the Lulan king during a banquet. The new ruler was chosen by the Han, and the city was renamed Shanshan, though the older name lingered like a shadow. From then on, Lulan was more firmly tied to China's interests. Watchtowers and relay stations were established along the desert's edge. Han soldiers marched across its sands. Official seals and administrative orders began to appear, written in classical Chinese and buried for centuries beneath shifting dunes. But this control did not ensure prosperity. Lulan's decline came slowly, not in fire, but in thirst. In the 3rd and 4th century CE, the Tarim River had changed course. Without water, the fields withered, the reeds dried, trade routes shifted to the south, the caravans stopped coming. And so, the people of Lulan left. No one knows exactly when this last family walked away. There was no record of farewell. No inscribed tablets saying, "This is the end." They simply faded, leaving pots half filled with grain and sandals neatly placed by the doors. When explorers like Sven Hedin rediscovered Lulan in the early 20th century, what they found was astonishing in its silence. Walls still stood, roof beams rested in the dust, and most hauntingly, hundreds of wooden slips and paper scrolls lay preserved in the dry soil. These were not royal decrees. They were mundane tax records, marriage contracts, quests for grain, orders for officials to inspect salt production. One fragment, barely more than a few inches long, read, "Send firewood. The supply is low. Winter approaches." It was in these scraps that Lulan lived again. But how does a place vanish so completely? How does a city, once vital to the world's longest overland trade route, disappear from maps and memory? Perhaps the more pressing question is this: what does it mean that the most detailed record Lulan left behind was its paperwork? In the quiet, sandy expanse of the Taklamakan Desert, the remnants of Lulan lay as an echo of what it once was, once thriving trading hub that had seen many empires rise and fall, yet whose own end seemed to come with a quiet resignation. It was not one sudden catastrophe that ended Lulan's reign, but the gradual shift of life in a place shaped by transient fortune and dwindling resources. This section of Lulan's history is filled with the kind of quiet disappearance that often goes unnoticed by grand historians. But it is this very obscurity that shapes the deeper story of civilizations long forgotten. When the Han Dynasty first began to establish its foothold along the Silk Road, Lulan was already positioned as a crucial stop for the caravans traveling between China and the West. To the Chinese, it was a foreign kingdom, but one whose significance could not be overlooked. Its strategic location near the Lop Nur, a salt lake, allowed it to act as a hub for all that passed through the vast arid spaces between the civilizations of the East and West. But with the rise of Han power came their military presence. The Han quickly established their military outposts along the trade routes to protect their interests from the Jiannu nomads and other threats. Lulan, originally an independent and thriving oasis city, was brought under the direct control of the Han in 77 BCE. This shift marked the beginning of a new chapter 1, in which Lulan's original independence was overshadowed by the administrative and military machine of China. At first, Lulan's residents adapted, becoming more aligned with Han culture, including adopting Chinese bureaucratic systems and writing. The kingdom became a part of the Greater Silk Road, offering not only goods, but also culture and ideas that blended together in a symbiotic relationship. The people of Lulan maintained their local customs while absorbing the technological and administrative innovations from the larger Chinese state. It was not a violent takeover, but rather an assimilation driven by practical concerned safety, commerce, and governance. But even this integration would not guarantee survival. Lulan's position was always tenuous, and the dependence on the Tarim River and the fluctuating water levels of Lop Nur proved to be an unreliable foundation. While the city prospered during the height of the Silk Road, it was still perched on the edge of desert, where resources like water and arable land were finite and unpredictable. By the time the 3rd and 4th centuries rolled around, the city had begun to show signs of decline. The Lop Nur, once a reliable source of water, began to dry up as the climate subtly shifted. The river that had sustained the farmlands and filled the wells began to withdraw. And with it, the caravans that had once passed through Lulan also shifted their routes, finding new places to rest and replenish. The residents of Lulan, once proud and prosperous, could only watch as the desert slowly reclaimed the land. The records from this period, albeit sparse, show that the government in Lulan began to falter as well. There were fewer documents left behind, fewer contracts, fewer letters. People abandoned their posts and moved away, driven not just by the environmental collapse, but by a sense of growing irrelevance. Lulan's importance as a military outpost faded as the Chinese Empire's control over the region tightened. Today, the northern regions became less of a threat as the Jiannu Empire receded, and the Silk Road became more focused on maritime routes. As time passed, the once thriving kingdom became increasingly isolated. The transition from prosperity to abandonment was slow, but it was inevitable. Lulan was a city built by the convergence of many forces: trade, politics, geography, and as those forces slowly dissipated, so too did the need for Lulan. But as the great walls fell and the marketplaces emptied, something else began to emerge: fragments, the mundane scraps of a civilization that had been too focused on survival to make grandiose monuments or to boast of great conquests. Asterisk, asterisk, it wasn't until the early 20th century that Lulan began to speak again, albeit in fragments. 1900. A remarkable discovery was made in the caves of Dunhuang, located on the northern edge of the Taklamakan Desert. Thousands of manuscripts and wooden tablets, most dating back to the first centuries of the first millennium, were unearthed by the Chinese explorer Orlstein. Among these fragments, some were written in the Sogdian script, a language of merchants, scribes, and scholars of Central Asia. It was through these quiet writings that Lulan returned to history, not with the fanfare of kings and soldiers, but with the humble documentation of the mundane. The documents discovered were not royal decrees or battle plans. They were trade records, tax documents, and letters between merchants. These fragments tell of goods being traded: silk, salt, wheat, and other staple crops that had once flourished in Lulan's oasis. One of the most remarkable finds was a letter written by a merchant who had traded grain with Lulan's city center. It was dated just before the city's final decline. The merchant expresses growing concern over the water supply, with the references to the shifting course of the Lapnur. His letter speaks of the difficulty in getting shipments through and mentions that the once regular caravans were no longer making their trips in other parts of the cave. Scholars found fragments of tax records, lists of goods and taxes owed to the local government. These records, though fragmentary, painted a portrait of a society attempting to maintain control despite the encroaching desert and shifting political landscapes. But the most poignant discovery in Lulan's scattered remains is the preserved burial site near the edges of the city. Tombs were found that told the story of its people in a way that no formal history could. They were not magnificent royal tombs with gold and jewels, but simple burials, some in shallow graves and others in more elaborate tombs. The bodies, preserved in the arid climate, lay with their personal belongings: comb, pottery, sandals. There were no statues or grand epitaphs marking their graves. There were no military victories to commemorate. Instead, the graves whispered of ordinary lives lived at the crossroads of the world. In one grave, a woolen hat had been placed on the head of the deceased, carefully stitched with red dye. Tearing in another, a child's toy was found: a small clay figurine, faded but still recognizable. These objects, small and simple, tell us that Lulan's people were not simply part of an empire or a passing moment in history. They were individuals living through the cyclical tides of history. Asterisk, asterisk. Today, the city of Lulan lies buried under the same dust that once blew across its markets. The salt flats of Lapnor, now completely dried out, stand where the once thriving oasis sat. The landscape is harsh, unforgiving, and eerily silent. There are no longer any markets to bustle in, no more letters to be written, no more trade to be transacted. But Lulan has not completely disappeared. The story of its gradual decline, its life on the Silk Road, in a strange way, it was buried and then uncovered, still captures the imagination of historians and explorers. In a way, Lulan's story is the story of all forgotten kingdoms, those that were not erased by violence, but by the slow withdrawal of time and the forces of nature. Its legacy is not found in palaces or statues, but in fragments, papers, letters, and tombs that tell us that survival is often more important than glory. And perhaps the most profound question remains: what do we truly remember? Only what is preserved in marble, or also the the quiet, everyday things that pass through the cracks of history. The sun over the Taklamakan does not rise with Tramid, arrives slowly, diffusing its pale light across a flat horizon. In the forgotten realm where Lulan once stood, that light reveals nothing grand. There are no temples with high spires, no walls jutting proudly into the air. There are only small depressions in the earth, faint outlines of rooms once occupied, occasional timber fragments that once framed the homes of scribes, merchants, soldiers, and children. The winds do not whistle with stories. They hum softly, as if reluctant to stir memories that time has already smoothed into silence. Yet, what remains of Lulan tells a tale not of collapse, but of quiet exhaustion. It is not a city that was destroyed. It is a city that simply stopped being needed. And then stopped being by the 4th century CE. Lulan had become less of a city and more of a way station whose visitors no longer came. The Silk Road had rerouted itself, following paths with more reliable water or better protection from the desert's whims. Lop Nur, the lake that had nourished the city's life and defined its geography, shrank and wandered. The Tarim River, never entirely predictable, pulled away from Lulan's grasp, and with water gone, no amount of trade, politics, or memory could save it. For decades, possibly over a century, small clusters of people remained, families who resisted the pull of migration. Hermits who clung to land, not for profit, but because it had once been home. But their stories faded with them, never written, never spoken beyond whispers. And one day, there were none left. No caravan bells, no cracked sandals leaving prints in the dust. Just emptiness. And that emptiness, paradoxically, became Lulan's preservation, because it was never replaced. No great city rose upon its ruins. The land was too harsh. No farmers plowed over it. No conqueror saw it as a place of use. It was, in a strange way, perfectly forgotten. And that is why, when explorers came more than 1,000 years later, so much was still waiting beneath the dust. In 1906, Arl Stein, a British-Hungarian archaeologist and surveyor, stepped into that silence. He arrived with Camel's assistance, and the distinct sense that somewhere in the flat brown monotony, the desert might still be keeping secrets. His mission wasn't to rediscover Lulan. Alone he was documenting the old Silk Road, but when he stumbled across the desolate site, it was as if the past had waited quietly for him to arrive. He found wood-beamed houses, reduced to frames, but still bearing structure. He discovered pottery shards strewn like sleeping seeds, and, most hauntingly, he unearthed bowed skeletal remains of Lulan's last citizens, preserved by the arid climate with an almost painful intimacy. One of them, a woman, lay with her boots still on, her face turned slightly to the side, strands of hair still curled along her skull. She became known as the Beauty of Lulan, not because of artistic vanity, but because the preservation was so eerie, so precise, that even after nearly 2,000 years, she looked not fictional, but remembered. She became a symbol, not of greatness, but of endurance. A symbol not carved into stone or cast in bronze, but lying gently in the sand, as though she had fallen asleep during a long journey and simply hadn't woken up. Her body, carbon dated to around 1800 BC, long before the Lulan kingdom proper, suggests that the site had been part of a continuum of settlement long before formal kingdoms or written records. She predated the Silk Road. She predated even the Han dynasty's expansion. And yet, her presence affirmed that this patch of land had always mattered to someone. As archaeologists delved deeper, they uncovered timbered documents, tin, flat wooden slips inscribed with official texts, some bearing the seals of Lulan's administrators under Han control. These weren't grand histories. Were bureaucratic notices about shipments, appointments, grain distribution, okay, the mundane functions of a town trying to manage its people. And yet, these scraps are how we now know Lulan, a fragment of cloth, dyed with faded indigo and worn to softness, a sandal strap left behind near a collapsed building, spoon carved from bone. These are not artifacts that shout, they whisper. And in their whispering, they reveal a city not built to dazzle, but to endure until it, come by the time of the Tang dynasty 618 to 907 CE. Lulan was barely a memory. Okay. The Chinese no longer referred to it by name. Okay. Other cities along the Silk Road, like Dunhuang or Turfan, had risen in prominence. Lulan's name, once printed on imperial maps, had vanished. The desert didn't devour it quickly. The city was not a victim of catastrophe. It was simply outlived by the needs of trade and the movements of people, like a well-worn path that gradually becomes grassed over when footsteps no longer pass through it. Today, Lulan is technically located within the modern-day Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, but you can't visit it easily. The area is controlled. The military restricts access. The dry lake bed of Lopner nearby was, for many years, used for nuclear testing by the Chinese government. Even the modern silence around Lulan feels politically charged, as if the city's fate remains entangled in the state's imagination, not merely a historic site, but a place suspended between relevance and burial. And so, once again, Lulan becomes inaccessible, not through desert, but through borders. Still, for those who know to look, Lulan remains a case study in slow forgetting, not a Pompeii, buried instantly by lava and ash, not a Troy, revived and fought over in myth and excavation, but a quiet place whose decline is the story of all places left behind by the roots of progress, a settlement born of geography, undone by the changing winds, forgotten by mapmakers, and then rediscovered by scholars who knew that the footprints of history often lay not in capitals, but in outposts. Perhaps the lesson of Lulan is not one of tragedy, but of impermanence. Cities may rise for reasons that no longer apply centuries later. Kingdoms may form out of necessity and vanish when that necessity shifts. And sometimes the only true monuments are the letters left in a cave, the sandals worn thin by 1,000 walks to the well, the hand that once wrote a shipping record in ink that faded under desert sun. When the night falls over the Taklamakan again, and the wind moves softly across the salt flats, nothing disturbs the dust where Lulan sleeps. The stars above remain indifferent, as they were 2,000 years ago. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear it beneath the silence, beyond the shifting sands, in the bones of a woman who rests with her boots on. What does it mean to vanish so completely and yet still be found? Good night.